And you are watching Sunday Agenda. American author Mark Danner is one of the world's foremost writers. He's reported and analysed foreign affairs, politics and war for the past 25 years. His latest book, Stripping Bare the Body, Politics, Violence and War, looks at some of the darkest and most cruel conflicts of recent years. In particular, he examines the part played in all of them by American foreign policy. I spoke to Mark Danner during his recent trip to Australia as a visitor for the US Study Centre. Mark Danner, thanks for joining us on Sunday Agenda.
Thank you for having me.
The central thesis in your reporting is in the metaphor that violence and war strips bare the body of society to get a real understanding of what goes on underneath. Why do you say that?
Well, I think when you look at situations of war, of coups d'etat, civil war, genocide, the various things, forms of violence that I write about in the book, you see societies at their most exposed.
In the end, though, doesn't violence in war really just tell us that humans are so flawed and that cruelty will ever continue?
I don't think so. I think it's probably likely that war will continue, certainly. Although it's a fact that the number of wars ebbs and flows. We're now actually at a low point, believe it or not, depending on how you count. War certainly won't go away, but I think some wars are crueler than the others, and some wars, frankly, are stupider than others. I mean, the Iraq War is a very good example of a kind of self-inflicted wound the United States struck itself after the attacks of 9/11. So I think you're right that war and cruelty are constants in human affairs, but wars individually, of course, are quite different and are cruel or not so cruel. And I write about, I'm afraid, in Stripping Bare the Body, exceptionally cruel ones, including the genocidal war in the Balkans, of course.
You do write about, you concentrate on the bloodshed that has really been Haiti's history and the horrors in Bosnia and Croatia and then Iraq. Why those three in particular? Just because you're saying they are stupid wars and particularly cruel?
I think that's partly the reason. I've taken, as I explained in the introduction to Stripping Bare, each of those, it seems to me, is a kind of emblematic conflict. What happened in Haiti, the struggle for a democratic transition, was really an emblematic conflict of the late Cold War. That is, the United States had backed the Duvalier regime, the dictatorship that fell, essentially because it was worried about communism and communist penetration in the Caribbean and in the Western Hemisphere. So the struggle over democracy there was really a conflict that symbolized the end of the Cold War. The Balkan Wars were very much wars of the post-Cold War world, where the United States had announced the end of history after the Cold War, that, you know, everything now is going to be liberal democracy and peace, and instead you had this enormous genocide where the U.S. stood aside and essentially let it happen. And finally, the Iraq War, it seems to me, was a classic war of the so-called War on Terror, where the U.S. struck out against the Iraqi regime with enormous ambitions to make the Middle East democratic, or at least that was the stated ambition, and in so doing completely exaggerated what American power could do. And the results, of course, were rather catastrophic for U.S. interests and also for the Iraqi people.
Well, let's have a look. Let's have a look just at Haiti, because it's obviously been in the news recently because of the massive earthquake. Now, after hopefully dealing with the humanitarian crisis there, do you think this could be a chance at a break with Haiti's violent political past, a chance to do something different politically?
It breaks my heart because I feel like I've heard the rhetoric of new beginnings many, many times when it comes to Haiti. First, when I arrived there in '86 at the fall of the Duvalier dictatorship, and I wrote about Haiti's transition to democracy. That was my subtitle of my piece for the New York Times. And, of course, that transition has not yet come to pass. Rebuilding the buildings is one thing, but remaking the political culture is quite another. It's a 200-year vivid and violent history that really reflects colonial times, a government that is all about extracting wealth from the country, squeezing and sucking, as the Haitian phrase has it. suce, squeeze and suck, is the system. And it was like that when the white colonists were ruling over 500,000 black slaves, and it's like it now when the elite is ruling over 8 million fantastically poor Haitians.
Yeah. You really point the finger very strongly, very vehemently at successive failures of American governments, and in particular the last several presidents. You have very harsh conclusions about them. Why, briefly?
Well, I think in the time since the end of the Cold War, American foreign policy has had distinctly mixed results. After talking about the end of history, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the first thing that happened, of course, were a couple of horrible genocides, one in the Balkans, one in Rwanda, and both of them the U.S. stood by and essentially let happen. I think those were very severe mistakes that the presidents in question, George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton, would like to do over. Bill Clinton has said that. And finally, and secondly, there was the Iraq War, which I think was a significantly self-inflicted wound. So I think these were the U.S. trying to find its footing after the verities of the Cold War and not doing, thus far, a particularly good job. And that's why I'm critical.
You have some criticism for those who enlist, perhaps on the other side, young men and sometimes women to strap bombs to themselves or put bombs in cars and blow up other innocents. Do the other side, so to speak, also lack the human empathy you say that some Western policymakers and politicians do?
Well, that's a extremely profound question, Helen. I think
you've got 1 minute. Sorry.
Well, thank you. Thanks for that. I don't think I can equal the profundity of the question, but I'd simply say that those people you're talking about are very dedicated people, and they're willing to sacrifice their lives for an idea. It's a horrible thing to watch, a horrible thing to see, and particularly when it kills scores of people in the streets of Baghdad or the streets of Kabul, not to mention the streets of New York City. It appalls us. Nonetheless, the only way that's going to stop happening, I think, at the end of the day, is for those individuals to stop having an interest in attacking the United States because they see it as the grand puppet master behind the Mubarak regime in Egypt, this House of Saud in Saudi Arabia, all these repressive regimes in the Middle East that they're fighting against. And that's something that's very hard to get past because we're talking about half a century of U.S. foreign policy. Very difficult to change, but it will have to be changed, I think.
Just finally, I want to ask you, you report in great detail, and it's very chilling, the evidence from the massacre at Srebrenica and the Bosnian War, which you call the saddest story. As a reporter, how do you spend weeks, maybe months, mired in death and violence and lies and obfuscation, and come up for air to not only report it, but to keep sane and clear-eyed?
Well, the book, is dedicated to my mother. It says, to my mother, in answer to her persistent question, why can't you go somewhere nice for a change?
That did make me laugh.
What my mother always tells me.
I'm with her.
I think these stories may be surrounded by a lot of bloodshed and violence, but they're also fascinating stories. They involve human beings at their ultimate point of struggle and stress. There's not only violence there, but I think redemption. So I think it would be wrong, I think, for me certainly to characterize the stories I've told as simply tales of darkness. They're not. I think there's a lot of light in them too, and I hope readers will find that there's light in stripping bare the body as well. I certainly think there is, and I hope readers will find the same.
It's an extraordinary piece of analysis and reporting, Mark Danner. We thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Helen.
I'm Helen Daly. Thanks for watching Sunday Agenda. See you next week.